Okay, hello everyone and welcome to today's event. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com. I'm joined today by Mike Cassidy, CTO of Fastpath, for a session on Dynamics AX Audit Trail Best Practices. As we get started, please know that you can add your feedback and ask questions anytime using the Q&A block that you should see to the right of the main presentation area. I know Mike will be leaving some time for questions near the end, but enter those at any point as we go along. So without further delay, please allow me to welcome Mike to start things off.
Thank you, Jason, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this session today on setting up audit trails, and thanks for joining us today. As Jason mentioned, my name is Mike Cassidy. I'm the CTO here at Fastpath. At Fastpath, we specialize in security, audit, and compliance. So we are an ISV. We build tools in those areas, and we work with a lot of customers in those different areas. The goal of today's session is going to really be talking about best practices, how you can go through and set up your audit trails, and then we'll also discuss some of the native functionality that's in AX around audit trail as well. So we're really going to focus on how you should be going about this from your organization standpoint. And just to, I guess, give you a little bit of background on me, I've been working in the dynamic space for the last 9 years. So I've worked with a lot of customers over those years, over that time, in the areas of security, audit, and compliance. But we have a lot of customers that do have auditing requirements around change tracking, and we're really going to focus on that today. Some of you may have heard me speak before at some of the AXUG sessions like a summit or a local chapter meeting. I used to do a lot of convergence sessions as well, although convergence no longer exists. So that's enough about me. Let's go ahead and get into our agenda for the day. Really, before we really start talking about how to use the tools and how to go out and set up an audit, we need to talk about what we're going to audit. And so that's what a lot of our focus is going to be on today is the best practice to go out and determine, what in our environment we need to be auditing, how to go through that process of identifying those areas, and then we'll actually talking about how to implement and set that up. One of the key areas is going to be the organizational risk profile. So hopefully some of the individuals on the call have been through that process before and have gone through and set up or gone through a risk analysis internally in their organization. But we'll talk about kind of some of the key things to go through when you're doing that and some of the things to be thinking about. We will then talk about the implementation side of actually setting up your audit trail and how to go about that, what options are out there for tools, and both natively or if you want to do something custom or third party, kind of the different alternatives there. And then we'll finish up with some pitfalls that we see a lot of customers run into and kind of reiterate some of the best practices in those areas. And then also talk about what to do once you begin auditing. There's a lot of things, we go through and spend a lot of time determining what we want to track, but how do we actually manage that over time? What's going to be our process for actually reviewing that data and where's the value in that data as well. So those are the different areas we're going to be going through. As Jason pointed out, I will leave some time at the end for questions. So if you do have any of those, feel free to type those in throughout the session, and I'll address those at the end. The first thing we want to do is go out and determine what we want to audit. So, the very first thing to do is go out and from a holistic organizational perspective, you need to start at a high level and really begin to understand your business completely. There's a lot of different types of risk out there. There's things like there's financial risk, there's organizational risk, there's physical risk, right? There's risk that people could break into your building. Now, some of those things you're not going to track with an audit trail tool, but holistically, we need to understand our business completely so we can evaluate and address all of that risk. When we're doing that analysis, we're going to find that some things are more probable to happen. So, it's more likely that certain risk could be exposed or in our environment. But there may be other risks that maybe isn't as probable, but has a higher dollar impact on our organization. So, if it did happen, it could have a significant impact on our financials or some other area in our organization. So we want to go in and understand all of the different levels in our organization and what other tools we're evaluating. So one of those tools could be, or processes could be segregation of duties. I talk about that a lot in my security sessions in different areas, but it does impact audit trail as well. Some larger organizations, typically larger organizations are going to have a better SOD set up and be able to segregate their duties better than smaller organizations. So, if in those smaller organizations it becomes more difficult to set up SOD, so our audit trail requirements may change. We may have different requirements on what we're going to track from a data perspective because we're not able to implement SOD to the level that maybe a larger organization is able to. So those are the things we're evaluating. A basic example would be, in a large organization, you may have one employee that manages vendors, another employee that manages bank accounts, and someone else that actually manages paying those vendors. But in your small organization, we may not have that option. So it may be one person. So now we need to look and say, okay, if we can't segregate that from a security standpoint, how are we going to address that from an audit trail perspective? How are we going to monitor that risk and ensure that, there's nothing fraudulent going on in our organization? So your audit's really going to depend on your specific organization, and everyone on this call may have a different risk profile than other people or other companies or organizations on the call as well. So the better you can implement segregation of duties, the less risk you're going to have in your organization. And if you truly have a great SOD methodology and setup, then really you start looking at things like collusion that are going to allow someone to do something fraudulent versus the small organization where someone may just have access to all of those different elements. Another thing to be aware of are outside controls or outside systems that may interact with your AX data. Oftentimes, we just think about AX or our ERP system internally, and we're thinking about, how are we going to set up security, and how are we going to set up audit trail, and how are we going to track those different areas. But we have to remember that there's other integrations. So a lot of companies use CRM to integrate with AX. So their actual customers are created in CRM and pushed into your AX environment. So what type of controls do we have around that? Do we have controls around CRM that are actually monitoring, what's being able to be pushed into our AX environment? Another thing we want to think about when we're talking about audit trail is what other types of controls do you have in your environment? Oftentimes people will go out and say, I need to track every GL entry that goes into my environment. And everyone knows GL is probably one of your highest volume transaction areas. And potentially you do need to do that. But be aware that there are, in some cases, that data is stored somewhere else. And so if we have the ability to go out and query and run reports on our GL external from Audit Trail, then why would we track it? And so these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about when we're going through this process is in narrowing down what we actually want to track. So be aware if there's somewhere else you can get the data, it's stored historically in AX or something like that, let's leverage that data and take the impact of, the performance impact of using an audit trail off of the system. So we want to evaluate all of those different levels. Of course, we want to impact or evaluate what are the highest dollar impact areas. It's not that we're only going to track the highest dollar impact areas, but we do want to understand the monetary impact of the risk so we can use that information when determining what we want to track. Also, audit requirements. So again, everyone on this call may have different requirements around what they need to track based on their audit or their audit trail. Or I'm sorry, said that wrong, on their audit requirements. You may have a SOX requirement, maybe you have HIPAA, maybe you have FDA, depending on what your specific audit requirements are, it's going to vary on what you need to focus your audit trails on. So those are the things we want to evaluate when we're determining what we want to audit. Now, we talked earlier about, going through and evaluating our risk profile, and understanding our entire business. And we want to really be able to qualify and quantify those risks. So let's first go out and identify where are those high risk areas. When you evaluated the different controls you have in place and the different integrations you have in your environment, where are the areas that we need to be concerned about that we don't have control around, that we may want to use an audit trail for. And again, back to the segregation of duties, and I don't want to focus too much on segregation of duties, but as we're going through our risk profile, when we're determining are we going to track this with audit trail, we also need to evaluate, can we handle this another way? Can we handle it with an SOD scenario? Can we implement SOD and actually reduce our level of risk there? What types of risk do you have? There's a lot of different types of risk. A lot of people just think about, the data in their system. But, you have risk of, fire, floods, earthquakes. A lot of that risk can be mitigated with things like, insurance or external processes. But you want to think about all of this. When we're talking about a risk profile, it's the entire organization. That's really, I guess, the message I'm trying to convey, is that it's not just our financial data. It goes beyond that, but then ultimately we're going to come back and say, do we have a risk that someone's out there altering payables information? And then, back to what's the dollar impact to that risk? And can you quantify that risk and qualify it, as I mentioned earlier? And a classic example of this would be, I talked about every company being different. If you're a manufacturing company and you have inventory on hand, you are going to have a different risk profile than a company that's, an online-based company. So a couple examples that I can think of, customers that I know exist in the AX community. There's a couple companies that make beer. And so they're going to have a physical inventory that they have a risk that someone's walking out the back door with a case of beer, where you have other companies. I know one company that does online, it's an online job posting board for IT folks. And, their risk, they don't have that physical inventory risk. Their risk is going to be based around, more of the data that's in their systems, their customer list and all of that data that's stored around those job profiles versus a physical inventory where you maybe have someone, your physical inventory, maybe you have your employees damaging the product so that they can sell it at a cheaper rate. Those are all the different types of risks that we want to evaluate. As we're doing that, we're going to try to identify how probable it is to happen and what would be the impact of that risk. And so that's how we qualify and quantify that, is to understand that. And then as we move into the audit trail portion, we're going to use that information now that we've developed and completed our risk profile. We're going to use that information to actually determine how we're going to implement our audit trail strategy or methodology. So from an audit trail best practice standpoint, you want to leverage that risk profile. So we're going to go out and we want to take a risk-based approach. And anyone, I don't know if there's anyone on the call that's sat through my sessions before, but you'll hear me say this often, a risk-based approach, whether it's an audit trail setup, if it's a security access review, we always want to be focused on the highest risk areas. And the reason for that is, in most cases, it's not feasible to evaluate everything. We can't go out and track every single data change inside of AX and try to review all of those changes. If we do, it's just not going to be feasible. It's not going to give us the output we want, and we're going to miss things, and it's really not going to be effective for what we're trying to do. So we want to take a risk-based approach. Let's find the highest risk areas, the areas that are most critical to our business, and let's focus on tracking those areas. And And so we want to find the right balance, of the things we want to track and things we don't want to track. And when we're going through that process of evaluating, we're going to begin to sit down as an organization and determine, okay, these are, based on our risk profile, these are the highest risk areas that we want to focus on. And we start looking at those areas. Now we're going to start mapping those areas to our data. So, okay, where does that data actually live? And when you start doing that, you're going to go out and evaluate what tables contain that data. So, the VIN table or CUS table inside of AX, those are areas that I may want to track from an audit trail perspective. But when you're going through that process as an organization, not only do you want to identify the tables, but you want to take that all the way down to the field level. So when you begin going to that level, I'm going to go out and say, I realize I want to track vendors, but that doesn't mean I want to track every single field in the vendor table. I want to identify the highest, most critical areas or fields within that table and really focus my audit on those areas. And by doing that, it helps us a number of ways over time. And I have them listed out here on the slide, but the first thing is, it reduces the performance hit that we have. By tracking less at runtime, we ultimately have a lower performance impact because we have less data to process during that transaction on the audit side. It's also going to reduce the amount of storage costs that we have. So by tracking less data, we have less data to store. So it's going to reduce our storage costs. It's going to improve our reporting performance because now when we start to go out and perform those reports or process those reports, we have less data to process because we've already narrowed it on the tracking side to only focus on critical areas. So our reports are only processing data in those critical areas. And then, our accuracy as a reviewer, this is the biggest advantage you get by going out and really taking this down to the field level is your reviews become more accurate. Because as a reviewer, I'm going to be much more accurate when I have everything I'm looking at is critical. I've already narrowed the scope down to the highest critical areas, and I know as I'm going through that everything I'm looking at is critical. So I don't have to sift through, pages and pages of data that's irrelevant. I'm able to see those areas that are highest, the highest critical areas as I'm going through that process. So, we have to find that right balance between tracking too much and tracking too little. And that's something that, as an organization, it may, you may zero that in or kind of fine tune that over time to get all the right data. But as we're doing that, we want to make sure we test it. We're going to go out and set up an audit trail, and we want to make sure we test to understand, not only, are we getting the correct data? Do we have the data we need for this? But also, what's the performance impact? I always tell people, make sure you test these things under load. A lot of times you go out and you turn something on, you test it in a test environment, say, okay, well, let's throw this in production. And when you do that, you don't realize that, okay, I went from 1 or 2 transactions to 1 million transactions, and all of a sudden we have a performance problem. So we want to make sure that we are testing and understanding the impact of these items before we actually put it into an environment. A few more best practices. We want to use the reporting to filter out information. As much as we can, we want to only track what's relevant. But there could be areas where you want to find specific scenarios. And so one of those examples would be, maybe I just want to look at any POs that are over $10,000. I can handle that from a reporting standpoint because I can go out, I can identify all of those POs, and I may have a separate review process that those go through because of the dollar impact that's involved there. Another thing we see a lot of times from an audit perspective is that you want to monitor things that are happening kind of outside the bounds of normal business. So if you see someone that's out there updating vendor information at 3 a.m., is that when they should really be doing this? Is that data something we want to look at? Why are they doing that? So we want to be able to identify those types of areas where things are happening, kind of out of the scope of what we would expect. Another example would be the PO limit. We see areas where, someone has a PO limit of $10,000, and so what do? They go out and they have 3 different POs that are for $9,900 or $9,999 because I just want to stay under that limit. Those are the types of things that we're going to try to identify, and we can use reporting with filters and different things to actually try to capture those different areas. Start small. What I mean by that is, go out and really narrow down your scope. Start with your basic areas. A lot of people are going to start with master data, parameter and setup data, user security information, and maybe some transactional data as well. But start small, and then you can expand your audit trail setup and kind of fine tune it as you go along. And so that may be, over a few weeks or over a few months, or it could be years, but let's start small and not try to take on too much at the beginning, and then we can expand as we need there. The ownership, as far as doing these reviews, we really need to push this back into the hands of the BPOs. So our business process owners, they are knowledgeable in these areas. They know who should be out there making these changes and the impact of these changes. Oftentimes we see these reports all pushed to IT. Well, is the IT person the person that should be determining if a purchase order is valid or not, or if that person should have entered it? Probably not. So we want to make sure we're putting these reports in the hands of the correct people. Allow those people to do their job, give them the information. And so that's where we talk about that reporting, being able to focus on specific areas, and provide a vendor change report and a customer change report, and allow the BPOs to actually do that. And the worst case is that no one's reporting on this data, right? We want to make sure that if we're going through the effort of actually collecting data, sure, it's great to have that data if I ever want to go back and look at it someday, but we need to be monitoring these changes on an ongoing basis, and that's what your auditor is going to be looking for. Oftentimes, the auditor is going to come in and say, I don't want to look at all your vendor changes, but I want to know that you were looking at your vendor changes, whether it was monthly or quarterly or whatever your cadence is, but they want to make sure that you're out there reviewing this information and actually evaluating and being proactive about catching things that are going on in your environment. And the last thing, that's the review. The reason we put that there is, make sure you're reviewing the data. The value really is diminished if you are not out there actually looking at this data and evaluating it to understand what's going on in your environment. So let's jump in and let's begin talking about some of the tools. So out of the box, inside of AX, we have what's called the database log. This is the native functionality. It's really remained pretty much the same for almost all versions of AX. It really hasn't changed a lot. So everyone on the call, regardless of version, you're probably familiar with the database log. And if not, someone in your organization is probably familiar and either maybe you're using it, maybe you evaluated it and it didn't work for your organization. But at some point, that's something you're going to cross. Alerts, I list alerts here. I wouldn't really call them an audit trail tool, but there is some functionality involved with the alerts that allow you to do some types of auditing type scenarios. So I just provide them here as an example. You may be doing something custom. So, potentially you've gone out and you've built your own custom tracking. So maybe you've actually gone out and used SQL triggers to track changes at the database level. Maybe you've had your development team or your partner maybe has developed some custom tracking inside of AX to track certain areas within the AX client or in the AOS. The one thing I do caution people, if you are using customizations, is be aware who has access to that code. Because if you're using some sort of custom code to track something, it's very easy for a developer to go out and say, well, track this when it's not this user or something like that, where they could just ignore themselves and, maybe they're doing some things that aren't being caught by the audit trail. So those are the things we want to monitor. Of course, our standard change tracking of code changes and those types of things should catch something like that, but we want to be aware of that risk and understand that as well. And then the last option are third-party tools. I will mention Fastpath does have an audit trail tool that we leverage. I'll talk about it a little bit at the end, but there's a lot of things that we do with our tool from a best practice standpoint that will help customers out. Primarily for today's conversation, I do want to focus on the out-of-box functionality and how you can leverage what's native in AX for your specific organization. So when we start talking about the database log, it's going to track the data changes, the things you would expect. It's going to track, your user, the date, the time, the old value and new value for that actual tool or for that actual change. Some of the limitations. In my opinion, the database log is really designed more as a debugging tool that you would turn on for a period of time, when you want to evaluate something going on in your environment, and then turn off once you've done that evaluation. From an audit perspective, what we're really looking at is we want a tool that we're going to turn on and leave on, and then be able to go back and look at changes, for a selected period of time. So I want to have my audit trail on consistently, and then be able to go back and say, okay, show me all the vendor changes for September, and show me the vendor changes for August. The debugging tool, customers do use it for those scenarios, or I'm sorry, debugging tool, I should call it the database log, is used for some areas. Customers, I'm sure there's individuals on the call that are using it in that way. But there's kind of some limitations. It's not real easy to do those types of reporting without some customizations on your end to actually get in and pull that information in a better format. From a performance standpoint, we always want to make sure we understand the impact on performance. And this is the one area, I am a technical person, but the one area where I will go into kind of a technical level is that when the database log is turned on for a table, it actually changes the way AX functions for that table. And the reason I point that out is, if you're updating a mass set of records, maybe 5,000 records, natively AX will just make one call to the database and update all of those. Once you turn the database log on, it begins processing row by row. So now instead of one, call to the database, I have 5,000 trips to the database, and you can imagine the performance impact there. So that's something we want to be aware of as we turn this on. We want to be aware that, and especially in high volume transaction areas, that there is a pretty significant performance impact. And I would, most customers, just from I guess an experience standpoint, most customers I worked with, the biggest reason that they're not using the database log in more than they are today is usually performance. So they've either, determined they can't use it, or they're using it on a more limited basis. So again, that comes back to narrowing your scope and only focusing on your most critical areas becomes even more important because of that performance impact. So just something to be aware of, and that's just the nature of the tool. We just want to be aware of the limitations there. Another limitation is that it only tracks changes made inside of AX. So, if you have an external tool or application accessing and updating AX data, if you have a DBA or somebody updating data directly in SQL, that's going to not be tracked. So the database log's only going to track changes that come through the AOS, and that's really the only way you can do that. Another thing to mention here, if you are going through and trying to build out, let's say, a custom tracking scenario where you want to go out and track changes with SQL triggers and your developers are going to build that themselves. One of the limitations with AX is that every change that comes through the AOS, it makes the change in SQL with a service account. So if Jason went out and made a change, rather than that change, when we use my SQL trigger, rather than that change coming to SQL as Jason, it comes through as the service account. So I'm not able to determine who actually made the change. There's obviously reasons that AX does that, and they don't want the users all having access to SQL, which would be a bad situation. But it limits us on the audit trail side. So we're a little bit limited without doing something custom and building something around that. We're not able to simply use a SQL trigger to capture changes and understand who the user was that made that system or that change. We work with a number of different ERPs. We work with about 11 different ERPs from, SAP and Oracle to all the Dynamics products. So we see a lot of variation in these different areas. So, for Dynamics GP, for example, everything comes through as the actual user. So SQL triggers work great for customers because they can go out and just turn on that trigger and they know who made the change. On AX, it's more complex with the service account. So it's somewhat of a limitation. I mean, there's a valuable reason why it comes through as a service account, but it limits on what we can do there. Another area would be code changes. As far as code changes, depending on if you're on AX 2009 or 2012, the way you would implement code change tracking, it would be different. In AX 2009, we had a file-based system. In 2012, we have the model database. So, and then it will be different again when we go to AX7 or Dynamics 365 for operations. I actually think I got that right. So when you go to those different systems, it's going to be different, but the one thing to be aware of is that the database log does not handle code changes. So we need to be aware and make sure that we have other processes that are going to, allow you to do that, because we want to make sure we monitor what's going into our system. We understand what code changes are going to be in there. Admin changes, this is a pretty common thing where we want to understand what the system administrators have done in our environment or what they're doing in our environment. So a lot of times, you can use filtering. So you can go out and narrow down your audit data and say, I want to focus on just the admins and see exactly what they did. So, we want to build those reports that are targeted for those areas so that we can focus our review on exactly what those admins are doing. And then maintaining audit data, regardless of what system you're using, whether you're using a custom system, the database log, a third-party tool, you want to make sure you have a process and thresholds around how much audit data you need to maintain in your environment and how you're going to manage that data. So, for example, you want to understand how much data do I need to be active? So how much data do I want in my active reporting? How much data do I want to keep in an archive, which is, data that I can, isn't in my active reporting for performance reasons, but I can access very quickly. And then at what point can we purge that data and rely on a database backup? Excuse me. Because a lot of times I'll talk to customers and they say, well, I want to maintain my last 10 years worth of data. And that's what the auditor requires. Well, that's great, but, by the time you've gone through 10 years, depending on what you're tracking, you're going to have a very large data set to manage. And, how efficient are your reports going to be? Because as that data grows over time, it's going to have some issues around that. So you just want to make sure you understand the impact and you have some methodology for that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and walk through just kind of a generic setup, the database log. Again, this is the native functionality in AX. And I just have a few screenshots. Most of you that have used this before, you're familiar with this. This is a pretty basic just setup here. But the first thing we'll look at here is just the database log setup window. You can go out and select your field or your tables. So here you can see I've selected the vendor table, and then I'm restricting those fields that I want to track. So back to our risk-based approach, there's things like birth date and birthplace. These are a pretty common example I give that in most likely that is not high risk for your business. It potentially could be, but I'm guessing it's not. So let's not track it. I tell people, if you're not going to ever review the data, don't track it. So we want to go through and selectively determine which fields are critical to us, and that's part of going through our initial risk profile and analysis. Then once we've selected those fields, this is just kind of the next screen in the setup. You can see, you want to track new transactions, you want to track deleted transactions, and then you want to track your fields, selected fields that are going to be updated as well. So you can go ahead and select those, and like I said, narrow your scope as much as possible. And then lastly, you're able to go in and actually report on that data and see what data has been changed in your environment. This is one of the areas out of everything with the database log. There's several limitations, but this is one of the areas that I think customers really struggle with. The reports here are just, it's not real easy to do that filtering. It's not real easy to identify exactly what was changed. You definitely can see the old value down here on the right. You see the previous value was a 0 for the credit max field, and then the new value is 10,000. So that's what was changed. But you can see a lot of other fields that are in here that weren't necessarily changed. So we want to, ideally from an audit perspective, we want to be able to focus on just those areas that changed, and we want to do a holistic reporting. So we want to be able to go out and say, show me all the vendor changes for the past 30 days or or for September, whatever it may be. And it's not real easy in this format to do that. I do have an example of a report that I pulled from the database log. I'm going to go ahead and share that with you here real quick. So in this example here, this is the type of data you can get out of the system. This does require some coding. From a technical perspective, I'll say that the data, it's stored in kind of a blob field, and so you have to go in and interpret that data, and it's not overly easy to do, but you can get this type of data out of here. So you can see that it's more of a flat file. So you see the description, the information here as far as the table, the field, the old value, new value, date, time, and user. The key thing here is now that I have it in this format, I can do that filtering. I can do that targeted approach where I'm only going to look for specific areas. So you do want to be able to do that, but the limitation is it takes some work to get here. But it is possible to get that out. But I think customers, see this as a much more feasible report to manage than some of the other the reporting that we showed on the previous screen, which was just kind of an individual transaction by transaction, and then looking down here in the middle area. So the next area I wanted to talk about are alerts. Within alerts, again, these are not what I wouldn't call this audit trail functionality, but there are definitely aspects of it that allow you to do some auditing type things. So you can set up a couple different types of alerts. You can either have notifications, so those are going to pop up the window inside of AX and notify you that something has occurred. You could also do email. One of the advantages, and this is also going to be a limitation, I will tell you, but an advantage is you can do immediate notification of events. So you can immediately find out. Oftentimes audit trails, you're doing that prior 30 days type things, and it's not necessarily an immediate alert of that event. So that's one of the advantages, but you also notice that that's one of the disadvantages. Because if we hit an area that's really high volume, oftentimes what customers do, or end users do, is they go out and in Outlook, they create a filter or a rule that says, anytime I get this email with this subject, go ahead and put it in this folder over here, and then I never look at them. Because I just, I'm getting 50 of them a day, and I just don't have time to go and look at them all, so I'm just going to go ahead and filter those out. And that's what we don't want, right? We want this data to be able to be looked at, inside of the system, so or evaluated by the end users. So, we don't want them filtering it out. We want to make sure they're actually reviewing this. Another area would be the reporting, right? We're actually sending those alerts, but there's no real historic reporting, and that's why it's not really an audit trail tool. It's an alert, right? It's a way to identify when a specific thing has changed, but there's no real historic reporting that's going to go along with that to help us out in those areas. This is the setup window of the alerts. And again, I just wanted to kind of show it similar to the database logs so you're aware of what it looks like if you've never seen it before. Basically, when you're on a form inside of AX, you can right-click and say Create New Alert. From there, you can go out and set up different types of alerts. So down here at the bottom, you can see, it could be when a record is deleted, when a record has been created. You could also do it on a field level. So you can go out and say, whenever this field is set to a specific value or greater than a value, or that field has changed, you can go out and actually set that up to notify someone via that notification or the alert that we talked about earlier. So you can definitely set those up inside the alerting system. So now let's talk about some of the pitfalls that we've seen with customers over time. The number one thing, and I'm sure there's individuals on this call that have heard it from their customer or from their auditors, is, well, we want you to track everything. Or, I can't tell you how many times I've had a customer just say, well, I want to know everything that happens in my environment. It's not practical. It's not feasible. It's really just, it's not something that you can do. And the reason for that is, from a practical standpoint, the overhead is too much. The impact on your performance in your system is going to be significant if you try to track everything, regardless of what tool you're using. Any audit trail tool that you turn on, any of the options I gave you, there is a performance hit. At some point, there's a performance hit, and if you try to track everything, it's going to be too much. And really, you're going to get little value out of that. If you track everything, it's going to be so much data. It's so overwhelming that the person going through that, the business process owner reviewing that data, they're not going to be able to identify anything because they're just going to have pages and pages full of data, and they're not really going to be able to target specific areas that they need to target. So the next thing from one thing also to mention on that, if your auditor does come to you and say, you know what, you need to be able to track everything in your environment, you need to go back to that auditor and push back on them and say, this is why we can't, and explain to them that their performance impact and the limited value of having that much data, and trying to maintain that data over time and the cost of storing all that data. You need to push back on your auditor and explain to them why you're auditing what you're auditing, why you've narrowed your area, based on your risk profile and those types of things. So have that conversation with your auditor to make sure that you don't just track everything because that's what they want you to do. Another area, I kind of hit on this earlier, but don't use audit trails as a substitute for operational or financial reports. If there's other areas where you can get this data. So earlier I mentioned, if you can get the GL transactions from a historical table inside of AX, let's use that. There's no point in having the performance hit of tracking this if we can get the data elsewhere. Now, maybe you can't get all the data and there is a valid reason to track it, but make sure that we're actually getting the data that we want in the data we need in those scenarios. Inefficient audit reports, we want to make sure that we're actually capturing the data that we need to get out of the system. And so, we want to make sure that we're capturing the user, the date and time, and all of that information. I'll share with you another report here quickly. Oops. Let me share my screen again. But when I come out and look at, we have an example here of a report, and this has all of that data, the sample data we talked about, the company and the fields and all of that good stuff. But you'll notice over here, this is an area where, we're tracking that user, and this is what can happen if you're tracking with a SQL trigger and you don't actually, you're capturing the AOS account. So what value does it give me? It's great that I know that this record changed or this field changed, But at the end of the day, it doesn't really provide a lot of value if I can't identify the user making that change. So those are some of the things that we see customers run into when they try to use the custom type thing. So make sure you have a solution and an answer in order to address that. And if your development team's coming to you saying, hey, we can do this, we can build this for you internally, that's great if they can, but make sure they can provide all of the data you need. And again, only track the things that are critical. I'm sure there's a lot of extra fields in this report that, this was just a sample, so it wasn't really designed the appropriate way, a risk-based approach. So there's probably several fields in here that we shouldn't be tracking. So make sure, kind of what we iterated earlier, that you're only tracking your most critical areas. And then the last thing here is the 500 versus 1 million. If you go to your business process owner and say, I can give you a report with 500 lines or a report with 1 million lines to review, which one do you think they'll pick? Which one is going to be easier for them to manage and actually do an appropriate evaluation on? It's going to be the 500. So we want to narrow the scope, both on the setup side of only tracking our critical areas, but then also build reports with the appropriate filters that are going to allow them to target just the data that they need to focus on. So that's all the part of the implementation, is to make sure that when we start doing our repetitive reviews, that these people are getting and have access to only the data that they need to do that. So we've talked about going through the process. We've talked about a lot of these things. Ultimately, what do we do after all of this data has been collected? We have Audit Trail on. We've identified our critical areas. What's the long-term plan here? Well, number one is review. If we're never going to review it, then that's a problem. So we want to make sure that we go out and we're reviewing this data. We want to make sure we have processes around that as to being able to monitor that these reviews are being done on a timely basis. So we want to make sure that we're managing that, and going out and evaluating when we do our review, is it the right person making the change? Should this person have access to make that change? Where did the change come from? Is it from, did it come through AX? Did it come through an external application? Did the DBA make the change? When was the change made? Was it during business hours? Was it after business hours? All the things we talked about earlier is, making sure that we're actually going through those steps and reviewing and performing the reviews appropriately. Who owns the data? We talked about this earlier. The business process owners, we need to identify which person in our organization is responsible for reviewing vendor changes. And again, it's not always IT. It shouldn't be IT. Let's go out and identify those individuals. Let's make sure they're aware of, what their responsibility is, and make sure that we're giving them the data that they need to perform those reviews. And the third object or item here I kind of mentioned earlier, make sure we're doing that on a timely fashion. So again, back to the auditor, they don't want to review this data. They want to make sure that you're reviewing the data and you're doing it on a repetitive basis. So they want to make sure you're reviewing vendor changes, weekly or monthly or whatever the cadence is, but make sure you're actually going out there doing those reviews. You need to have some sort of sign-off so you can actually sign off on your findings for that review and have documentation, because, the last thing your auditor wants to think is they came and you ran all these reports the day before they showed up. So you want to make sure that you have items in place to monitor that these reviews are being done, and also that you're signing off and documenting your findings in those scenarios. And then, ultimately, we want to make sure, I talked about this a little bit on the last Excel file, we want to make sure we're capturing the right data. Who made the change, what they changed, where that change came from, and when and how that change occurred. So I'll show you one more file here. This one is, whoops, let me grab that file. This is just another example of all those fields that we're really concerned about. So, here we're able to quickly identify, the vendor who made a change, the field that was updated in this scenario, the type of event, was it an add, an update, or a delete. We can see the old value, the new value, the date, time, user, and application. So this report here, this is actually from one of our systems. We can actually track changes that are made outside of AX. So we understand that. So we want to make sure that we have that visibility and we're able to go through and provide all of this information. So regardless of what tool you're using, make sure that you have all of the information you have at the end of the day for those people to effectively go out and review your environment. So the one thing I do want to point out before I jump into the questions, I mentioned a couple times that Fastpath does have an audit trail tool. I'm not going to demo it or anything. I don't want this to be a sales presentation, but I do want to point out that we do have a tool. If you have any interest in that, we could definitely follow up and discuss that later. But our tool, it's a trigger-based solution. It's going to allow you to track changes. It's going to allow you to track changes inside of AX. Outside of AX, we've overcome the AOS issue that I mentioned earlier. And our tool is truly built from an auditor's perspective. We have auditors on staff here, and we have a number of templates as far as setup and then also reporting of that tool that are really targeted at what an auditor's expectation is. And so we really come at it from the audit perspective to go out and say, you know what, I need to be able to filter and focus for specific areas. I need to be able to identify who made these changes. I need to monitor code changes. I need to monitor what my DBA is doing. Because anytime, regardless, again, of what tool you're using, if your DBA is updating data inside of SQL, you want to make sure that you can tie that off to a change ticket, and you want to make sure you're aware that that change occurred. So if you are using the database log, you want to look at, okay, what am I going to do to monitor at the SQL level? And so you may have to implement something else implement some sort of process around that, or use a third-party tool like Fastpath that can do it. Those are the things you're going to want to go through and evaluate. The key is understand all the different levels where risk lies, understand the risk profile for your business, and then make sure you implement that and are able to get all of the data out of the system that you need. And again, there's multiple options. Just be aware that you educate yourself on all of those options, whether it's the database log, if you're looking the custom route, if you're looking at Fastpath from a third-party standpoint, or other options. Make sure that you're able to go through and actually evaluate all of those different areas and make the best decision for your organization. So with that, I do want to jump over. I know there's some questions inside of the database, or I almost said database log. There's some questions inside of the Q&A panel here. So if you do have questions, feel free to post those there. And let's go ahead and look at a couple of them. The first question here is there any major differences from a JSOX and SOX compliance audit? And I would leave that question to my audit team. I come from the technical side, so I do deal with a lot of audit, but the specific differences between those two, I would not be the person to answer that. I believe there are a lot of similarities. Just at a high level, we get into segregation of duties and a lot of those areas that come under both scenarios, and the tools that you're going to use to address both of those scenarios are often the same tool. So we do work with customers that have both of those audit requirements, but as far as the main difference, I could definitely answer that offline, but I would inquire with my audit team to do that. So Sean has a question here. Logging actions of particular users, i.e. DBAs, versus logging transactions to a particular table. That is something, so you're looking to track, I want to know everything everything a system admin is doing versus just who's updating vendors. The database log, obviously there's no functionality to track specific users at all. I will tell you from a performance standpoint, just from a best practice standpoint, you're never going to want to monitor every transaction in your environment because of the performance hit. And so if you go out and say, well, I want to track everything that a certain user does, that means you have to check basically every transaction to make whether it was that user or not, or a set of users. So the performance impact is significant. So even if you want to track a user and say, I want to know everything this user's done, you're going to want to identify your critical areas, and you're going to track those critical areas. And if they're updating, their personal settings or something, we really don't care about that. We care about the critical data they're updating. So you're going to narrow down the critical data, and you're going to handle that, seeing what particular users are doing, either through filtering or setting up reports to say, this is my admin report, and it's going to show me all the admin changes that were made to my critical data. Or I will tell you the Fastpath tool has some conditional auditing where you can, on certain tables, you can say, I only want to track when specific users make changes. So you have that option, or you handle it on the reporting side. But to go in and say I want to track everything this user does in the system isn't really feasible because of the amount of monitoring you have to do. And I'm not aware of any tool that's going to do that for you. The next question here: does it have to be a filter, or can specific tracking be done for admins? I guess that's kind of the same question. So yeah, you either want to filter the data, you could build specific reports focused on admins, the filter, or as I mentioned, there are some conditional auditing options where you only audit certain users with the Fastpath tool. So you could go out and say, for table 1, I know it's a high volume transaction, so I only want to know when Jason makes a change to it. That is capability in Fastpath, but it's not available in the database log. From a custom perspective, obviously, that would come back to your specific scenario and development team. Logging actions of particular users versus logging transactions to a particular table. I think that's the same question. So I'll refer to my other answers on that. Looks like it was in there again. I think some of these were just maybe submitted more than once. And then Daniel has a question. Is there a quick/easy way to enable database logging on all the tables that store setups? For example, accounts payable setup, accounts payable parameters. I am not aware of anything, Daniel, that is a quick way to do that, short of some sort of customization. There's no I don't think there's anything out there. You would basically have to go out and identify those parameter and set up tables and be able to set that up yourself. Unless you build a custom process that does it, I don't think there's anything that's enables you to do that really quickly. So you're kind of left managing that yourself. And then that's one of the difficult things with the database log is the setup, the reporting. They're just not real efficient. And there's some limitations on what you can do there. But unfortunately, I wish there was, because that's a key area that a lot of customers want to track is, who's modifying my parameters, and I want to be aware anytime a parameter change is made. Sometimes users don't even know they're making those changes, and ultimately they have an impact on your whole system, and you're trying to figure out where that change came from. So it's key to track those, but you really have to go out and identify those yourself. Again, with the Fastpath tool, we have some templates that help you do that quicker, but from a database log perspective, you would have to identify those on your own. So with that, I know we're right at the end of our hour. I don't see any questions in the log. I want to thank everyone for their time today. I know Jason's put a form down there. If you have any follow-up that you want, feel free to fill that form out, and we'd be glad to follow up with you. If you have any specific questions, my email is there on the screen. We're always glad to help customers, AX customers in the community, regardless if you own the Fastpath tools or not. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. So thanks for joining us today, and I will go ahead and turn it back over to Jason to finish up the call here.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Mike. We will end it there, and we have recorded today's event. We'll be making that available as well. Please do be on the lookout for a survey after you close out today. We appreciate any feedback you can give us on the session, and our speakers always appreciate that as well. That concludes today's session. Have a great day, everybody.